So good evening to you all as people come flooding in. Welcome to this Zoom session hosted by the Community Independence Project, and thank you for joining us tonight. So I'm Alana Johnson, one of the directors of the Community Independence Project and also the chair of the Victorian Women's Trust. And we have with us tonight the rest of the Community Independence Project team. We've got Kathy McGowan, Jill Briggs, Tina Jackson, Liz Miglioroni, Anya Geddes, and Dee Brooks. So great to have you all on board. Thank you very much for being here too and for doing all the work in the background that makes this happen. Before we get going, there's always some housekeeping regardless of whether we're face-to-face or in Zoom. So we want to let you know that this session tonight is being recorded. And so therefore, please ensure that you have your microphones turned off. And you are free to use the chat function to share any comments. And we thank you already for all the fantastic questions that have come through, and looking forward to our networking session at 8 o'clock, where you get the opportunity to talk to the panellists and ask some of those questions that are burning for you. So before we start, I'm coming to you from wonderful Taunurong country in northeast Victoria, and I want to acknowledge the First Nations people from across the vast land that we're all coming to from tonight. I want to acknowledge their connection to the land and the sea, and to the communities that are part of their heritage. I also want to acknowledge and honour the fact that our First Nations people are the longest living culture on this earth. And that is due all of our respect. Community Independence Project is absolutely delighted to have you here. So for those who are new to our project, it was born out of a sense of commitment that we wanted to see people be put at the centre of politics. And we have been involved in, this is our third year now, in supporting and enabling communities to come together and talk about what sort of representation they want in their electorate, what sort of values they want to see played out in our political system, and getting themselves organised to be the people who determine who represents them. So please go to our website if that interests you and join up. There's always very interesting speakers and lots of activity happening in the Community Independence Project that you're very welcome to be part of. So let me introduce this wonderful panel. We're very honoured to have these women from across rural Australia join us tonight. Firstly, we've got Dr. Helen Haines, who's the independent federal member for Indi in Victoria. Then Susie Teagan, who's the Chief Executive of the National Rural Health Alliance. We have Natalie Somerville, who's the President of Australian Women in Agriculture and coming to us tonight from South Australia. And Liz Brennan, who's the Director of the Rural, Regional and Remote Women's Network of Western Australia, who's normally in Kununurra, but tonight is joining us from Japan. Very special to have her here. So I want to thank you for joining us, all of you. And we look forward to this fascinating discussion that's going to happen. So the format tonight is really focusing on our four speakers and having an opportunity to actually get into a little bit of depth with them and hearing from them. And then later on at 8 o'clock, an opportunity for participants to have some discussion. So it's my job to facilitate and move around in this virtual stage, pretending that we're all sitting there together. And I'm going to turn to Helen first and have some discussion with her. So Helen, thank you very much for joining our session tonight.
Yes, absolutely, Alana. And thank you so very much for the invitation. Thank you to the Community Independence Project. Acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Banger country in northeast Victoria in the beautiful electorate of Indi. And hello to all my fellow panellists and to everyone who's joining us tonight.
Yes. So for those who don't know Helen, for a whole decade now, the electorate of Indi has been very politically active about issues that are important to them. So I presume that the good constituents of Indi have also been politically active around this upcoming referendum. So I'm interested to hear what we're seeing across your electorate, this electorate of Indi, which has led the way in the community independence movement. Give us a bit of an insight into what's happening in Indi and what you're seeing.
Thanks, Alana. So there's a lot happening in Indi, and it's happening from two directions. Fundamentally, when it comes to understanding what this referendum is about, I believe that my role as a community leader and indeed as the federal member for Indi is to make sure that the 115,000 constituents who I am responsible for as their federal MP understand, number one, that we're having a referendum. Number two, what the question that is being put to us is, what that's about and where to find information to help them understand what they're being asked to do. So I'm about 3/4 through a 10-town tour. I've been running information sessions around the electorate, kicking off with a very big session in Wodonga, which is the biggest town, biggest city in Indi, and Minister Burney joined us in Indi along with Dean Parkin. And we had a packed out community centre there. We had 420 people in the room and around 500 people online for that event. Then subsequent to that, I've been going around smaller towns, and I've been joined by Professor Kim Rubenstein, who's a constitutional law professor, James Blackwell, a Wiradjuri man. The next few days, I'm being joined by other speakers, including Senator Yana Stewart, Councillor Greg James from Shepparton, and also being joined by the Liberals for Yes campaigners as well. So we're going to small town halls and meeting with people and just answering questions, giving a bit of a 101 and then just taking any question that comes, everybody welcome. So that's the top-down bit. The ground-up bit is there's around 7 or 8 groups now across Indi who've formed in small towns and villages, and they're working really closely with their community. So they're doing door knocking. They've set up little hubs. They've got call flutes out, of course, but mostly they're having conversations. Some of that is through the Victorian Women's Trust process. Some of it's just conversations they're generating themselves through all their networks, and they're working busily from the ground up. And they've got a very extensive polling booths roster organised so that all those little polling booths across the 29,000 square kilometres of Indi will be womaned and manned during pre-poll and on polling day with great information, smiling local faces to engage with people as they step into the referendum. So that's what's going on in Indi, Alana. Pretty busy space.
Give us a sense, Helen, of how you see this collaborative arrangement where in Indi, the Member of Parliament and the constituents really do have a two, as you call it, a two-way relationship. How does that characterise what's happening in Indi compared to what you're seeing in other electorates? And what do you think the advantages are?
Oh, look, I'm seeing some tremendous things happening in other electorates, actually. Lots of things happening, particularly through my community independent colleagues on the crossbench. So lots of activity happening there. I think what is particularly a totem, I guess, of Indi is the way that we don't kind of presume that someone else is going to do the work. And that applies right across every policy area that we're trying to shift the dial on. So very much when it comes to the referendum, we started this by coming together as a group of the campaigners who worked alongside Kathy and I during our election campaigns and said to those people, as a core group to begin with, I called a meeting of them and said, what do you want to do? And lots of people responded to that and said, we want to get involved. Well, what does that look like? Well, we're not sure yet. But that iterated across the whole electorate. And the thing about a big rural and regional electorate like Indi is that a small town like Violet Town or Kinglake or Marysville, these very small villages, are quite different to a large centre like Wangaratta or Wodonga. So the key bit is, I think, finding your place in your community, in your small town, and responding in the way that makes sense for you. And that's how we go about our business in Indi more broadly, whether that be bushfire recovery, whether that be trying to improve the train network, whether that be working on activities around climate change. We try to contextualise it because there are many, many communities within this very big geographical footprint, Alana.
Yeah. So being politically active in rural and regional Australia is quite different, isn't it? Because as you've just described, a lot of it relies on, people's identification with their local community and the engagement they have there.
That's right. So it would not have been okay for me just to hold one event in our biggest town and think that everyone was going to come to that. It's really important, I think, to go to where people are at, and that's why I'm on a 10-town tour. It might even be up to 11, but 10-town tour sounds better, don't you reckon? And each of those events has been curated by the locals in those towns around how they want it to roll, where the venue should be, how it should look and feel, and who should be invited on the panel of speakers. So I think that's really important because then it makes sense to people. And I think the other reality, of course, is that not everyone has really, really good and reliable internet. So I think it's very important in my situation in a rural electorate to actually get out amongst the people, to go face to face, to give people the opportunity to turn up, to I guess get the look and feel and smell of what's going on, and then to chat with each other, because that's the key bit, I reckon, isn't it? Like, you may be feeling uncertain about what this referendum's about. You may have listened to a whole lot of various arguments that are coming at you, but there's nothing like saying to someone what did you reckon about that? And then talking it through. I think that's really powerful in rural and regional communities.
Yep. So, Helen, it's been really interesting, and I know that people will also be interested to talk about our political system in general and how it has responded to this whole referendum. So we might come back to you and talk about that after we've heard from some of the other panellists. So thank you for starting this off.
No worries, Alana. Let me say that I think the communities responded a whole lot better than the politicians.
Yeah. Yes, we might have a few things to say about that. Thank you very much. And we're going to have a chat with Susie now, where she is on screen. So, there she is. Hi,
Here
Susie.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, that's a pleasure. So you're with the National Rural Health Alliance, so you're all over the place.
I am.
But tonight coming to us from Sydney.
Yes.
You have an incredibly vast array of connections because you've worked in agriculture, education and health, and you know rural and regional Australia in a way that many other people don't. But let's just focus on health for the minute. So a lot of Australians are pretty astounded at the continuing poor health outcomes for Indigenous people. So from your perspective now and the work you're doing, can you give us a bit of an insight into the health gap and your comments about whether you think a voice could actually make any difference to that?
Well, the first thing is, as you said, the life expectancy is actually, it's appalling. Indigenous people in urban environments live 6 years longer than those people that live in remote and very remote and rural areas. And then secondly, the life expectancy is quite low. It's like 71 years old, and that's sort of more 1950s numbers of the general population. So there's still a long way to go. And Indigenous Australians tend to have more problems with heart disease, diabetes, chronic lower respiratory disease, lung disease, self-harm, mental health issues, and depression and arthritis and hearing loss, preventable vision loss, It's becoming, it's just not. The standard isn't changing in terms of what can we do to assist Aboriginal people. In terms of the National Rural Health Alliance, just so that everyone knows, we have a remit to support our 48 national member organisations, and many of those are people or agencies that deliver healthcare for the patient journey from the day that children are born to the end when they pass away. And so that could be anything like the RFDS or so we deal with the whole journey of the patient. We also deal with the whole journey of the clinician. It doesn't matter whether it's a medical practitioner or a nurse or an allied health professional or a pharmacist, from the day that students decide to study all the way to the end of their career, and then the research in rural and remote Australia. And what we actually know is that in rural and remote Australia, there's an underspend in health of $6.55 billion per annum. So that's $850 per person that we're not getting, that we should be getting, because that's what the city's getting. So in terms of Indigenous health, it's even worse purely because there's a disadvantage. And so it's a major change that needs to occur in terms of what can we do to assist and work with the Indigenous populations, because they do have very good models and approaches, and they're quite clear about how they wish for healthcare to be delivered. So, Ilana, in your question of how will the Indigenous voice change, or how could it change? So the Alliance advocates for policies that improve the health status and outcomes of Aboriginal health services, and also for the Aboriginal people. And we support the journey for reconciliation. And what does that mean? It means that we will try to do anything that supports better access for Aboriginal people, improved understanding of Indigenous health issues, and that's about research money actually going to rural Aboriginal research rather than it being in the city. It also means, and also obviously mainstream as well, because there's the population health of rural in general is terrible. And the other thing is, the National Rural Health Alliance has had a consultative process since 2019 with the Alliance, and has been a great supporter of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And then in addition to it, since then, and since the establishment of the First Nations Voice, we have supported our members to receive information and access information that will allow them to make the best decisions, not so much as an entity or as a corporate entity. It's really about individuals being given the opportunity to find out more so they can make a decision. And I'd just like to say here, sometimes people say that Australians are racist. I actually don't think they are. I came out to Australia not with a word of English at the age of 14. And it was tough, but they weren't racist. And I'm not, and I've lived in Alice Springs, and there are many people that are not racist. Maybe sometimes individuals are racist. And I think the majority of people that I've spoken with and entities that we've worked with are really wanting to ensure that Aboriginal people have an equal health access, and that they have equal health and well-being to the rest of Australia. And I'm pleased we're going to be speaking later about the political process, but also the fact that we are a democracy, and it has become so bad that people feel that they can't even talk about things anymore. And that is a great concern to me. But for a person that loves Australia, but from the National Rural Health Alliance perspective, The Alliance supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and also the First Nations voice.
Yes, so very interesting. And Susie, I'd like to come back to you and talk to you about, given your extensive knowledge of rural and regional communities across Australia, some thoughts you might have about how communities can engage and how closing, particularly the health gap, can become a reality that we can all participate in. So I'll give you a moment to think about that, and we'll invite Natalie to come forward and say a few things now. So, Natalie, welcome.
Thanks, Alana.
Whereabouts in South Australia are you?
So I am on Nudgera country, which is this stunning country behind me that you can see, which is based in the mid-north of South Australia.
Looks beautiful. Is that stunning behind you? Absolutely. I think I need a new shot behind me. So, Natalie, what a fascinating story you have, that you're a descendant of Torres Strait Islander people. You're a very successful woman in agribusiness. You're the president of Australian Women in Agriculture. What a background. And no doubt with all of the work that you've done and the connections you have a particular and individual perspective on history and on community relations in our rural and regional towns and on reconciliation. So I'm really interested for you to share with us what has really made you step up and be so visible and so active in this voice referendum movement?
Alana, I'm one to understand people's perspectives. So it took me a little while to listen and to read the different voices and commentary that's being put out there all around Australia. And it's important for me to do this because so we don't get the one-sided view. And I thought maybe I'm missing something. So I dug deeper and deeper to understand everybody's perspective. And I think, that informed decision is really important when it comes to this matter, especially if you're not across it all. It's really important to do the research behind such important decision making. So for me, I'm Torres Strait Islander. I'm living on Nudgera country here in South Australia, so not my traditional country. So I've also had to learn about what does the mob down here, what do they feel about this as well? It's really important to get that local, regional viewpoint and not just from my own backyard in terms of my traditional country. Not everyone has the same views on this. And it's really important to acknowledge that. And it depends on people's experience and it depends on people's knowledge level. But for me, I've been involved with promoting, my stance on the voice because I feel it is something we need to do as a country to move forward.
What's been the response in your life, your work life, your life in Australian women agriculture about being so visible, about your opinion and where you position yourself around the voice referendum? What's that been like for you? What sort of response have you had?
It's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from since it was announced to today. There has been a lot of discussions happen. There's been a lot of people approach me and ask my point of view. I suppose for me, my background comes from many different angles, from the agricultural angle, from, my community angle, from my Torres Strait Islander angle with that cultural lens with certain things. But one thing I can say about my journey so far is that being able to understand how the government system or the parliamentary system works and having a voice to advocate on your concerns is really, really important. If you don't speak up and say something, you get overlooked. And I think that's a really critical point to make, is understanding how our system works and how this can benefit all Australians, because it's not just about our First Nations people. And I don't want to offend anybody by saying the wrong terminology, whether it's Indigenous, First Nations or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We need to have this to benefit everybody. Everybody has their own journey, have their own history. For me, it's been quite different to, someone else in my community. And it's, there's not enough time to go into it tonight, but, I've lived and worked on the ground, grassroots community, and I've networked across Australia with Mob, and it's encouraging to me how many people are all moving forward, and I think that's another important point. We have to move forward with this. We can't just stand still.
So just to expand on that, Natalie, for you, in your understanding, tell us what moving forward looks like. What are your hopes that you see what's going to benefit us all by this moving forward? To what place? What does it look like for you?
So at the moment, we have a system that doesn't represent First Nations people. You have to really fight and spend a lot of money to get in there and advocate for your cause. And so I hope that this voice to Parliament will be the voice that we need. So in terms of that high level voice that we need in Parliament, that's independent, that's not attached to any particular group with particular party line. It's honest advocacy that we put forward that will benefit our mob. And then therefore it will benefit everybody, because the way the money is being spent and has been spent, I won't say all of it, but some of it is not appropriate, and it's not being fed back down to grassroots level. And so this particular system that's being proposed by The Voice will actually be directed by grassroots people and elevated up to The Voice and vice versa. So there'll be a two-way system happening here.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, what you're talking about is so familiar to rural women, because it's taken us the last, 20, 30 years to for women in agriculture and rural women as a whole to actually have a platform, to have a voice be heard. And a lot has changed in our society and our lives and our families because of that. And the power of being heard and the power of being taken notice of and validated and recognised is, you can't measure that, can you?
You certainly cannot measure that. And it's really important for me to acknowledge that particular, what you just said, Alana, 30 years of especially Australian women in agriculture having a really strong advocacy voice to better us. And I need to also acknowledge my elders before me and all of our leaders across Australia that have been really trying to promote the betterment of, Indigenous people in this country so that we can, all live the life that we want to.
Just a final question before I move on to this. We've touched on the notion about having a voice and a platform for a voice and how important it is. And there's many ways that people in contemporary Australia have that voice and speak to power. So it'd be worth you just explaining to us what your understanding is of why the Constitution, and why does this need to be embedded in the Constitution?
Yes, of course. So we all can go to any particular, representatives and share our concerns with them, and then or we can go to Parliament and share our concerns there's many ways we can share our concerns and try and elevate our needs. This particular model is about a voice that will be able to direct, empower. It's independent of government of the day, but it will inform the particular government, and it will be and the executive as well. But it won't. It will be independent, which is what we actually need.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to come back to talk to you a little bit further later on, and particularly around that whole notion of within our First Nations people in Australia, there's a lot of different opinion. So I'd be very interested to get your perspective on that. But I'm going to turn now to Liz and welcome her from Japan. And I think you there, Liz? She's coming?
Certainly, yeah.
So, Liz, I think you should tell everybody you've got the most beautiful wood panel wall behind you in some very heritage, beautiful Japanese villa.
Yeah, I would usually have the beautiful backdrop of Miraval Country up in Kununurra, but tonight I have the beautiful traditional Japanese ryokan that I'm staying at, sitting on a tatami floor in very remote Japan. So, konnichiwa from Japan all.
Lovely to have you. So Liz is well rooted in Western Australia and more recently moved to Kununurra to live there, but has worked in Papua New Guinea and been involved in agriculture for, well, as long as possible for a young person like you, for a long time. Been involved in Farmers for Climate Action and the Rural Regional Remote Women's Network and so many other things in rural Australia, and is a much admired voice. Was previously also president of Australian Women in Agriculture. So, Liz, a wealth of experience and knowledge for someone your age, and very pleased to have you here to share some thoughts with you. So just to probably dive straight in, Western Australia has very low support, it seems, for the yes vote and the referendum, more so than in any other state or territory potentially. So that's a pretty tough call. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, thanks, Alana. The stats this last couple of months have been, between 37 to 44% of people supporting a yes vote in Western Australia. So it's been really heartbreaking to see that kind of statistic in my home state of West Oz. And so I guess there are probably two things that I see that are really preventing a stronger support for yes in Western Australia, and that's around geography and around trust. So I mentioned I live up on Miraval Country in Kununurra, but I've lived my whole life in the electorate of Durack, which is the largest electorate in Australia and the fourth largest in the world. If I drove from Kununurra to Canberra, it would be 4,137 kilometres or a 44-hour drive. I say that statistic because Western Australia feels really far away from decision-making, and especially from Canberra. And I think that parochialism that Western Australians feel is by virtue of feeling very far away, from those decision-makers in Canberra. And interestingly for me, when I was reflecting upon this, it's actually such a kind of interesting similarity that we have with First Nations people who often feel that decisions, especially in the context of this discussion, often feel like decisions are made about them without them. And I think Western Australians have that same kind of a feeling. And I see it as a really beautiful point of commonality, of relativity and of shared humanity that we often don't think about. So that's the geography piece. And the second piece is about trust. And I guess specifically trusting government. So it was really interesting to hear Helen's, and hopefully we can kind of explore that a little bit further, Helen's remarks around political process. But this year in Australia, in Western Australia, and for those of you that might not have been privy to the Aboriginal, I guess the unravelling of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, which was first passed in 1972 and was being updated to really address some of the in response of the destruction of Juukan Gorge by Rio Tinto a little while ago. And the intention was fantastic. Like, it was really strong piece of legislation or intent of the legislation. But unfortunately, and I think all sides, or I guess most stakeholders in this process would agree that it was consultation wasn't fantastic and co-design wasn't fantastic. And that's both from those that were, I guess, for the legislation and against the legislation. Many people felt, and I guess many people that were going to be directly affected by this legislation and those in the broader community felt like it was really rushed and implementation wasn't fantastic. And so there was this really strong kind of sense from the West Australian public of like, what is government doing? They're not doing what they should be doing around consultation. And unfortunately, this has coincided, this concern that West Australians have has coincided, although it's a piece of state legislation, that it has unfortunately coincided with this broader conversation about constitutional change, recognising a voice to Parliament. It's undermined the trust that we do have in government, which is really unfortunate, I think, especially because they have the two kind of timelines have collapsed or overlaid rather. So I think Western Australia, it's a really tricky conversation, and I would invite Western Australians and remind them and people from right across the country, in fact, that, you know, what's happened with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, there is much to be learned, and many First Nations people have been saying, collaboration and co-design, mate, you know, hit me up, I'm up for it. And that wasn't so effective with the state legislation. But what we're talking about here with the voice is quite different. This is a fundamental recognition of First Nations people and of Australia, and enabling them a voice to Parliament that is advisory in nature, that people, decision makers, can understand and really equally grapple with the challenges that are being faced. And I think as West Australians, we know I live a long way away from our nation's capital, and having, this kind of direct route to decision makers I think is going to be fantastic.
Yeah. So in these next 3 weeks, it's a very short amount of time, what do you think needs to happen in Western Australia for people to actually realise what you're talking about, to see the difference between the Western Australian legislation, what's happened, the voice referendum, what's going on, what can ordinary people in their communities do that can help get past this sort of, bottleneck?
Yeah, sure. So I think and this is not paid advertisement, everyone who's listening online, without kind of talking to the community or kind of advocating for the Community Independence Project philosophies, it's really about those conversations that invite people rather than create this polarisation. And I guess the other thing that's really important is ensuring that we are finding sources of information that are factual, because there is a lot of, extreme social media is amazing because it, enables us to channel into information, but it also can be quite polarizing because the algorithm works off kind of extremities. So we need to ensure that we're having inviting and bringing people into a conversation that they feel like they can say, kind of ask the silly question, or have, the other premise that I would encourage people to consider is, one of my favourite sayings is, it's okay to have strong views rather, just loosely hold them, because they will meet other people with equally strong views. And the importance is finding, because chances are you agree on 80% of it, like there is commonality. And in Australia, if nothing else, this voice to Parliament is about recognition, about respect, and about fairness, which I'm pretty sure all Australians can agree that they are commonalities, even if you have different views. So I think, it might sound a little trivial, but it's these invitational conversations. One example that I can think of. So Alana mentioned that I've only been up in Kununurra for a short while. I've lived most of my life in the wheat belt on Balladon country up in Papua New Guinea. And there's this fella so I was a proud Kalingaree Cougars player for 6 years. There's a fella in my club who's the most loyal, most community-minded individual. And he and I fight like cats and dogs on Twitter because we have really strong, like, different views, and Twitter kind of, elicits that. But when we're at the pub after the footy game and netball game, we can have a robust conversation, and it's about the way in which we both have that conversation. It's invitational, it's robust, it's, what do you mean, mate? You pull your head in, or it's what, it was only a few weeks ago, I walked away from that conversation with a greater understanding and a shared humanity, and if nothing else, a greater connection, even though we hold different views.
Yeah. Very interesting insight in this, particularly for people watching who might not be in the social media world as much as you are, and like this notion that conversation can actually be an antidote to that, and that notion of the invitational conversation and how powerful that can be. So we've been watching you on the screen be a little slowed down by the distance between Australia and Japan. So it's been quite delightful. It's like a Japanese dance watching you at the minute. as your video is a little bit slower than you're speaking, but it's lovely. So I'll return to you shortly before we finish, but I'm going to go back to Helen now, and let's talk politics, Helen. Saying this is
Must
your
we?
realm. So it's been pretty terrible, the adversarial sort of partisan politics and how the political system has played out in this fall referendum and the sort of divisiveness that's been created. So really interested in your observations and comments about how that's happened, like how we understand it, where we put it, the place we put it when we see in comparison to everything else, how much influence you think it's actually having. Your general observations that you can share with us.
Thanks, Alana. Really big questions. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to, I was thinking as Nat was speaking about advocacy and how many people have opportunities for advocacy through to governments or decision makers, and indeed through to Parliament. And it just struck me why this kind of advocacy through the voice is different to other sorts of advocacy. And I guess how I think about this, there's a really good reason why our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need a constitutional advocacy pathway. And that is fundamentally about reconciliation and about truly acknowledging as a nation that these are our first peoples, and this land was occupied for 60,000+ years by continuous culture, and that in order to truly celebrate that and to truly reconcile with what happened next, and we understand all of the gaps spoken so eloquently just now around the significant gaps in life expectancy, for example. But to truly reconcile with our history and truly have an advocacy that makes sense in regard to the history of this beautiful nation of ours, this kind of advocacy through a voice is so right and so fitting and will make such a beautiful new chapter in our Constitution. And I think even understanding what our Constitution is has been a journey, and one that many people are absolutely on right now, that fundamental understanding of what the Constitution is and what a spare document it is, in so much as it's an architecture rather than a recipe book. And I often explain this to people, and I carry a copy of the Constitution with me. I have it all the time. I have it in my handbag, have it in the backpack, have it in the back of jeans. Yeah. And tonight I was meeting with some people, some local community folks at the Wangaratta little hub for the referendum, and the folks there gave me another fantastic, useful life hack. And they had they've printed just the new page that would be inserted into this little book. Right there, a new chapter 9 that would be the voice to Parliament. And you know what? It just, again, underscores what an elegant, what a simple, what a reconciling addition this would be to our Constitution. And to me, that's why this is such a powerful addition that we can make in terms of the advocacy of the people, our First Peoples. So there's that. Sometimes I hear that kind of simple explanation of reconciliation in the Parliament. I hear it in some of the debate speeches by individual members of Parliament as we move to pass the legislation to enable the referendum to even happen. But tragically, I think what this is boiled down to for many players, and I'm calling them players in our federal politics, is a winner takes all. And that's just is just an antithesis of what this sets out to be. This referendum sets out to unite Australia, to reconcile Australia, to bring us to a place whereby our First Nations people not only seek to advise governments of the day, whoever they might be, about closing the gap, but actually about improving life for all of us. And when I think about the advice that our First Nations Australians have brought to us around, well, things like land management, water management, cool burning, bushfire control, I think about the voice and how it could bring so much more knowledge to our Parliament and to our nation. And it's distressing, to be honest. I'm going to be really honest with you about how I've felt as a parliamentarian sitting through question time for the last 2 weeks and seeing the vitriol and the negativity and indeed I think the poisonous words that have been thrown across the chamber. And it's so far removed from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And so I could just see a chat saying that's so disappointing, and in fact it's gut-wrenching. And that's why I think these conversations, these invitations to come together and ask questions of any sort, and that's why what I love about my 10 town tours is that people are invited into a room, and I try to create as a community leader there a safe space to ask all sorts of questions. And people have questions, Alana, they're not one bit related to what the voice is, but they're deeply related to who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are, and what is the Constitution even about, and what was it with the founding fathers in 1901? Even the fact that they were fathers, not mothers, is important. We talk about feminism. We talk about so many elements to what it is to be part of this Australian nation. And in lots of ways, I'm kind of grateful that that's been brought up, actually, in this whole conversation about the voice.
I'm just going to make a comment there, Helen, about that's the unique beauty of community, isn't it? Conversations aren't just about issues. They're about, chin-wagging. They're about all sorts of things. They're about actually building community, and that these invitational conversations can take you all over the place. But actually it builds bonds between people. So I'm going to turn to Susie Teagan now, and I'm interested, Susie, in the whole, as you said, many organisations are associated with the National Rural Health Alliance. Tell me about what you're seeing in terms of people and their building of conversations and community. And are you seeing hopeful things out there in the health sector?
I think we are. The first thing is that all of the members that we have, which includes Indigenous organisations in the health and medical area, we've actually worked with them and listened to what their views are, and individually as organisations, but as CEOs, we've actually gone to speak to our friends and colleagues that have an Indigenous background just to see what their views are and their experiences are, because it's very difficult to come out with a public vision or a vision for an organisation without actually speaking to the people that it pertains to. And that's why I was mentioning before that Australians aren't racist, because they actually want Indigenous people to have well-being and good health, and to make sure that the funding dollar goes to them, to make sure that the policy supports them, to make sure that they are heard in terms of healthcare delivery. And we as an organisation alone, National Rural Health Alliance, has actually learned quite a bit from the ACCHO model, which is the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service. And we've developed an equivalent, which is called the PRIMS model, Primary Rural Integrated Health Service, purely because we know that when there are enough staff, it actually works really well because it's very much community driven. And so we've learned that from Aboriginal communities, and we use that opportunity. We use, their expertise in informing what our policies are and our approach is. So in terms of the constitutional change and the voice, you have to remember that as individuals, people still have have a broad group of views, and we are a very broad church. And so the best thing we can do is provide the opportunity to get the facts from all the different sides. We can provide the opportunity to discuss an issue. And I think that is the issue that has really been lacking in this whole campaign. It's not just been lacking from the different sides, and I'm not only talking about left and right, I'm talking about just in general. I was just speaking with somebody that lives in the southeast of South Australia, a young guy, probably about 28, 29. And I said, well, what are you thinking? Because that's where the farm is, where I've been living. What are you thinking about that? And he's going, well, I'm just sick and tired of, you can't even talk about it because people will have a go at you. Whether it's yes or no, they will just abuse you, so you'd rather not even raise it.
Yeah.
And that is what concerns me.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it will take me to Natalie and ask her this very difficult question. But, Susie's just been talking about conversations across the Australian community. Natalie, we know conversations within our First Nations communities is also difficult, and people are seeing the difference of opinion that exists within First Nations communities and seeing that as a sign of disunity and reading into it a whole lot of things that make them feel that that if Indigenous people aren't supporting this, why are we? What are your comments about such a critical aspect of this whole referendum campaign?
Yes, there are lots of views. There are lots of opinions, and that's why it took me some time to acknowledge and respect what everyone were promoting. There's sovereignty issues. People feel that sovereignty will be impacted if we go through with this referendum. There's treaty issues. People feel that their treaty journeys will be impacted at certain levels. Then there's also the other issue of it will divide a nation, which is quite an interesting concept because it is also being backed up with all these really, good examples of poor policy and issues that we currently have in Australia. So it has been really challenging, and I'm sure a lot of First Nations people feel the same. Some have had enough and really are really heavily impacted by the inappropriate discussions that are happening and have happened for a while. There are also people who are disengaged with the government and any government decisions because of the past policy that we've had in this country for over 200 years. It's a fact that that's the case, and I acknowledge that, and I also empathise as well with those views. So it's really important that when we do discuss this, that we acknowledge all of those views and all of those positions. However, there's one thing that perhaps needs a little bit more emphasis, and that's the Uluru Statement from the Voice. This was a really powerful piece of consultation that occurred. True engagement that occurred from many leaders from right around Australia coming together and agreeing on a piece of or a statement that will help us. It's an invitation for the general wider Australia to help our people move forward. Yeah, not everybody agrees with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I will say that now because that's the facts. But the majority, overwhelming majority of people do believe in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And today, as I was talking to the Commissioner for First Nations people here in SA, 80% of First Nations people across Australia are for the Voice. And that is astounding. So that tells me that policy that is created for our people is heavily supported for our people. And that's without all the other information that goes along with it. Like what is a constitution, and why does it matter that it's in there permanently versus this or that or the other?
Yep. You've given me the perfect lead in, and thank you for addressing that such difficult issue. So I'm just going to briefly turn to you, Liz, for a bit of a wind-up of this session. And let's have a positive lens on this. Yeah, I think the final statement should be some statement about why the Voice to Parliament can be such a beneficial thing for rural and regional Australia, and what we can all feel positive and hopeful about.
Thanks, Alana. This is not about winning something or losing something. This is about changing something. Enshrining a Voice to Parliament will create a greater level of political accountability from our elected representatives. Living in rural, regional, remote communities, we all know that we know what works best in our contexts, in our communities, and what our capacities are. And I think for me, in reflecting upon, leading up to this wonderful, robust conversation, was reflecting upon something that memoirist and poet Maya Angelou said, and I'm going to get her quote correctly: "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And I think we learned so much from our First Nations people, as Helen pointed to, in this country and around the world. And as we had elders from across Australia come to the heart of this nation and ask of us a simple thing. And it is just so important for us to listen to these voices and to vote yes at the referendum.
Yeah. Thank you, Liz. Well, how do I encapsulate all this wonderful wisdom that we've heard from these women? I suppose the things that have really resonated with me, and as we talk about, this is about rural women speaking out, and I'm hearing women speaking, and the words that are coming to me are the fact that this is not just about information, misinformation, where you get the information, what's the correct information. This is actually about looking into your heart. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart was an invitation to everyone in Australia to look into their own heart as to those things that we all agree we want as part of our Australian society, about recognition and respect and fairness and all those values that we want to be the platform for the generations to come. And I think we've got caught up in a lot of information battlement when there are other things at play that are just as important in this. Helen talks about the ability to actually build community by having conversations. And I love that notion that was spoken about, invitational conversations. Invitational conversations actually do everybody good. They build every community. And if we can invite people to have conversations, regardless of what their thoughts are, that are constructive and invitational and respectful, then we're actually going to end up in a better place as a country. And so I suppose we've got to actually trust the process. That if we go out there and we continue to have these respectful, invitational conversations, we actually are going to move forward. And so I suppose the last thing that really resonates with me, and I think so much resonates with rural and regional Australia, is following Helen's advice and just saying to people, so what do you reckon about the voice? Not loaded, not trying to convince, just actually asking a question that opens the doors. And for the next 3 weeks, we can make an enormous ripple effect across the country the more we actually step forward into those conversations and actually build our communities. So I want to thank you, Liz, and Susie and Natalie and Helen for sharing your insights with us. It's just been a delight, and we could be here for another hour, I think.